Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, welcome everyone. Today we're going deep, really deep into...
Deep dive.
That's right, a deep dive into Canada's incredible rise after World War II.
A fascinating period.
It really is. We're using this really well-researched history podcast episode as our guide today.
Great source.
Yeah, and we'll uncover how Canada went from, kind of a small player to a major force in the world.
A global powerhouse.
Exactly. We're talking about a country whose Navy started with just 7 warships.
7.
7. And they ended up with the 3rd largest Navy in the world.
Unbelievable growth.
And it wasn't just the Navy. We'll also talk about their troops on D-Day, their incredible courage.
Juno Beach.
Yeah, Juno Beach. They advanced further inland than any other Allied force. Just amazing.
Testament to their bravery and skill.
Absolutely. And then there's Canada's role in the Cold War, a different path,
Peacekeeping.
Yeah, peacekeeping. A really unique approach.
So let's dive into this transformation, shall we?
Let's do it. World War II seems to have been the catalyst for all of this.
It was a crucible moment.
The podcast highlights the incredible growth of their military during the war.
Exponential growth.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing. They went from a pretty small pre-war military to having the 3rd largest Navy and 4th largest Air Force in the world. Can you give us a sense of what their military was like before the war?
Well, before the war, Canada's military was pretty modest.
Modest?
Yeah. Reflecting their status as, a dominion within the British Empire. Their focus was mainly on coastal defense and supporting British forces.
So not exactly a global power at that point.
No, not at all. But the outbreak of World War II changed everything. They needed to defend their own territory and contribute to the Allied effort, and that meant mobilizing their entire nation for war.
And mobilize they did. Over 1 million Canadians served in the military during the war. That's incredible for a nation of its size at the time.
It's a testament to their commitment.
The podcast details some key operations where Canada's impact was really felt. Let's start with the Battle of the Atlantic.
Oh, the Atlantic.
Convoy escorts, U-boat threats, the perilous North Atlantic. It sounds terrifying.
It was absolutely crucial to the Allied victory.
How so?
Those convoys were the lifeline keeping Britain supplied with food, fuel, munitions, everything.
Wow, everything.
And Canada's Navy played a vital role protecting those convoys from German U-boats.
It must have been incredibly dangerous out there.
Oh, absolutely. The North Atlantic is vast, unforgiving.
The podcast mentions that Canadian ships used sonar and depth charges to counter the U-boat threat.
Yes.
Were there specific types of ships that were particularly effective in this role?
Well, destroyers and corvettes proved to be very well suited for anti-submarine warfare.
Ah, so
Destroyers were larger, faster, but also more expensive and took longer to build.
sure.
Corvettes, on the other hand, were smaller, simpler, and could be produced much more rapidly, making them vital for escorting those convoys.
So it was a mix of firepower and speed.
Exactly. They were armed with depth charges, equipped with sonar, allowing them to detect and attack those submerged U-boats.
So a constant game of cat and mouse out there on the open ocean.
It was a battle of wits and technology.
From the icy depths of the Atlantic, let's move to the beaches of Normandy D-Day Canadian forces landing on Juno Beach,
A pivotal moment.
facing fierce resistance, but ultimately pushing further inland than any other Allied force.
Their courage was remarkable.
Can you tell us more about the strategic significance of Juno Beach and what made the Canadian advance so successful?
Well, Juno Beach was one of 5 landing beaches assigned to the Allied forces on D-Day.
Right.
The Canadian sector was heavily defended by German forces, machine gun nests, artillery batteries, minefields, you name it.
It sounds like a nightmare.
It was intense fighting, but the Canadians managed to secure their objectives and establish a beachhead.
And their advance inland was particularly significant.
It was crucial. It allowed them to link up with British forces to the east and American forces to the west, creating a continuous Allied front line.
A united front.
Their success was due in part to their rigorous training, effective use of specialized armored vehicles, and just their unwavering determination.
It's inspiring to hear about their resilience.
It truly is.
And it wasn't just the Atlantic and Normandy where Canadian forces made their mark. The podcast also mentions the grueling Italian campaign.
Ah, yes. Italy.
Brutal conditions, mountainous terrain, stubborn German defenses. Or the unique challenges of fighting in Italy.
The Italian campaign was a long and arduous struggle.
I can imagine.
The terrain was exceptionally difficult. Battles fought up and down steep mountains across heavily defended river valleys.
Wow.
The Germans were well entrenched, determined to hold their ground.
So every advance was hard-fought.
Every inch. The Canadians had to adapt to this challenging environment, employing different tactics and equipment than they had used in other theaters of war.
So we're seeing Canada stepping up militarily on a global scale. But the war's impact wasn't limited to the battlefields, right? Canada's economy went through a radical transformation as well.
Absolutely. The Canadian economy shifted dramatically from peacetime production to a wartime footing,
Right.
churning out vast quantities of war materials, ships, aircraft vehicles, munitions, uniforms, you name it.
Wow, a complete overhaul.
This massive mobilization led to full employment, virtually eliminating unemployment.
That's incredible.
And perhaps even more significantly, it saw women entering the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking on jobs traditionally held by men.
Wow, that must have had a profound social and cultural impact.
It did. It challenged traditional gender roles and paved the way for greater equality in the post-war era.
Was there any resistance to this shift in gender roles?
There were certainly societal adjustments and some resistance to change, but the demands of wartime production often overshadowed those concerns.
I see.
Women proved themselves more than capable in a wide range of roles, contributing significantly to the war effort.
So a real turning point.
Yes. The war fundamentally reshaped Canada's social, economic, and industrial landscape.
Yeah.
By 1945, Canada emerged from the conflict a more industrialized, prosperous, and confident nation.
Ready to take on a new role in the world.
Exactly. They had proven their strength and were poised to embrace a new era. So as we've seen, World War II really was a turning point for Canada.
A real coming-of-age story.
They emerged from the conflict a transformed nation, ready to assert their newfound independence and take on a more prominent role on the world stage.
And then the Cold War began. A whole new set of challenges and opportunities.
Absolutely. The Cold War was a period of intense ideological rivalry between the capitalist West, led by the U.S., and the communist East, led by the Soviet Union.
Right, a global standoff that shaped everything.
It had a profound impact on international relations, shaping alliances, fueling arms races, and influencing domestic policies around the world.
So how did Canada navigate this complex and often volatile global landscape?
Well, Canada chose to align itself firmly with the West, joining NATO in 1949.
NATO, I think it would be helpful to break down what NATO is and why Canada's membership was so significant.
Of course, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was formed as a military alliance to counter the perceived threat from the Soviet Union and its allies in Eastern Europe.
A collective defense pact.
Exactly. The
Yeah.
key principle was collective defense. An attack on one member would be considered an attack on all.
A powerful
It was meant to deter aggression by ensuring a unified and overwhelming response to any Soviet expansionism. Canada's decision to join NATO signaled its commitment to collective security and its willingness to play a more active role in international affairs.
This was a clear departure from Canada's pre-war policy of relying on the British Empire for its security.
A sign of their growing independence.
But as you mentioned earlier, Canada didn't simply fall in line with the U.S. during the Cold War. They also charted their own course, pursuing a more independent and peace-oriented approach.
That's right. Canada recognized that the Cold War was not just a military standoff, but also an ideological battle for hearts and minds. They believed that a purely militaristic approach was insufficient and that diplomacy and multilateralism were essential for preventing conflict and building a more stable world order.
So a more nuanced approach.
Exactly.
This emphasis on peacekeeping really seems to have become a hallmark of Canadian foreign policy during the Cold War.
It did. Canada became deeply involved in United Nations peacekeeping operations around the world, from the Middle East to Africa to Asia. They earned a reputation for their impartiality, their commitment to resolving conflicts peacefully, and their ability to work with diverse nations and cultures.
It sounds like Canada was actively trying to de-escalate tensions and bridge divides rather than simply stockpiling weapons.
Yeah, they were committed to finding peaceful solutions.
But did they make any compromises to their sovereignty or independence by aligning with the U.S. and joining NATO?
It was a balancing act. Canada recognized the need for strong alliances to deter aggression and maintain security, but they also sought to preserve their own decision-making authority and pursue a distinct foreign policy that reflected their values.
A delicate balance.
It was. And the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 was a major test of that balance.
The Cuban Missile Crisis. A truly terrifying moment in history.
It was a 13-day standoff between the U.S. and the Soviet Union over the placement of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida.
So close. The world must have been on edge.
It was a moment of extreme tension. The fear of nuclear war was very real.
What was Canada's stance during this crisis?
Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, a staunch nationalist, initially hesitated to fully support the U.S. naval blockade of Cuba.
He wasn't immediately on board.
No, he wanted more concrete evidence of the Soviet missiles and preferred a diplomatic solution through the United Nations.
So he was taking a cautious approach.
He was. His hesitation caused some friction with the U.S., but he ultimately agreed to put Canadian forces on heightened alert and participate in the air defense of North America during the crisis.
A difficult decision. I imagine there was a lot of debate within Canada about the best course of action.
There was. Public opinion was divided. Some Canadians supported Diefenbaker's cautious approach, believing that he was acting in Canada's best interests by avoiding a rush to war. Others felt that Canada should have shown stronger solidarity with the U.S. and criticized Diefenbaker's hesitation as a sign of weakness.
A real dilemma with no easy answers.
It was. The Cuban Missile Crisis really put Canada's foreign policy to the test, forcing them to navigate a complex web of alliances, ideologies, and domestic pressures.
And through it all, they maintained their commitment to both collective security and their own independent foreign policy goals.
Exactly, a difficult balance to strike.
We know that in addition to NATO, Canada partnered with the U.S. to create NORAD in 1957. Can you tell us more about NORAD and its purpose?
NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, was formed as a joint U.S.-Canadian organization to provide early warning and defense against potential air attacks on North America.
Given that this was the height of the Cold War, I'm assuming the primary concern was a potential Soviet bomber attack carrying nuclear weapons.
You're absolutely right. The threat of a surprise Soviet air attack, especially as intercontinental ballistic missiles were still under development, was very real. NORAD was tasked with monitoring airspace over North America, detecting potential threats, and coordinating a rapid response.
So a vital part of the Cold War defense strategy for both countries.
Absolutely. NORAD was a tangible symbol of the close defense partnership between the U.S. and Canada, and a critical component of their shared security during a time of heightened global tensions.
And as we've discussed, Canada actively pursued peacekeeping as a cornerstone of its foreign policy during the Cold War. Were there any particularly notable examples of Canadian peacekeeping efforts?
Canada participated in numerous peacekeeping missions throughout the Cold War, but one that stands out is their role in the 1956 Suez crisis.
This is the crisis that led to future Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson winning the Nobel Peace Prize, right?
That's right. The Suez crisis involved Egypt, Britain, France, and Israel. It was a complex situation with competing interests and a real potential for wider conflict. Pearson, who was Canada's Minister of External Affairs at the time, played a pivotal role in de-escalating the crisis.
So Canada was right in the middle of it.
Pearson proposed the creation of a United Nations peacekeeping force to help stabilize the situation and oversee the withdrawal of British, French, and Israeli troops from Egypt.
A peacekeeping force. That was a groundbreaking idea at the time, wasn't it?
It was, and it proved to be a successful model for future peacekeeping operations. Pearson's diplomatic efforts earned him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1957, solidifying Canada's reputation as a peacemaker and a leader in international diplomacy.
It's remarkable how Canada used its influence to promote peace and diplomacy during such a tense period. But of course, the Cold War wasn't just playing out on the international stage. It also had a significant impact on Canada's domestic policies and society.
Absolutely. We've already touched upon the Gouzenko Affair, which exposed a Soviet spy ring operating within Canada in 1945. This incident, along with the broader Cold War anxieties about communist infiltration, had a profound impact on Canadian society.
There was a real fear of communist influence within Canada, wasn't there? Did this lead to any measures that infringed on civil liberties?
The Cold War definitely created a climate of suspicion and anxiety in Canada, and the government, under pressure to protect national security, implemented measures that sometimes came at the expense of individual rights and freedoms. Well, the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, were given expanded powers to monitor and investigate suspected communist sympathizers. There were loyalty oaths and security screenings for government employees. In some cases, individuals were denied employment or even deported based on flimsy evidence or unsubstantiated accusations.
This sounds very similar to the Red Scare that was happening in the United States at the same time. Was there any pushback against these measures within Canada?
There were certainly voices of dissent, civil liberties groups, academics, and some politicians raised concerns about the erosion of individual rights and freedoms. However, the prevailing mood fueled by Cold War anxieties was one of caution and vigilance. Many Canadians supported the government's efforts to safeguard national security, even if it meant accepting some limitations on personal freedoms.
So a complex and controversial period.
It was. The podcast mentions a historian named Jack Granatstein who has written extensively about this tension between national security and individual rights during the Cold War. What are some of his key arguments?
I'm interested to hear his perspective.
Granatstein argues that the Cold War forced Canada to make difficult choices. He acknowledges the legitimate threat posed by Soviet espionage and the need to protect national security. However, he also criticizes the government's overreach in some cases, arguing that their actions sometimes created a climate of fear and suspicion that was disproportionate to the actual threat.
So a balancing act gone wrong in some instances.
Perhaps. He highlights cases where individuals were unfairly targeted and their lives disrupted based on flimsy evidence or unsubstantiated allegations.
It's a reminder that even in times of crisis, it's crucial to safeguard fundamental freedoms and ensure that security measures are proportionate and grounded in evidence.
Absolutely. A vital lesson from that era.
But beyond the anxieties and security concerns, did the Cold War have any positive impacts on Canadian society?
It did the Cold War, while a period of heightened global tensions also spurred technological advancements, economic growth, and social change. The threat of nuclear war, while terrifying, also motivated investments in scientific research and development, leading to innovations in fields like aerospace communications and computing.
So a bit of a silver lining.
These advancements had spillover effects on the civilian economy, contributing to economic growth and rising living standards.
The Cold War, despite its inherent dangers, also had a hand in shaping the modern world as we know it. A fascinating paradox.
It is. The Cold War was a complex and multifaceted historical event with far-reaching consequences. It shaped global alliances, fueled technological innovation, influenced domestic policies, and left an indelible mark on the cultural landscape.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, exploring Canada's transformation during World War II and their complex journey through the Cold War era. But we'll pause our exploration here for now. Join us in Part 3, where we'll examine the post-Cold War world and how Canada has adapted to the challenges and opportunities of this new era.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Canada's journey on the world stage.
We covered a lot of ground already, haven't we?
We've traced their transformation through World War II and their navigation of the complexities of the Cold War. Now we arrive at a pivotal juncture.
The end of the Cold War. A whole new world.
A seismic shift in global dynamics with significant ramifications for Canada.
The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, it dramatically reshaped the world order. What did this new landscape mean for Canada's role in global affairs?
It was a time of profound change. The threat of nuclear annihilation receded. A wave of optimism swept the world. But Canada also faced the challenge of redefining its foreign policy priorities in a world where the old Cold War paradigms no longer applied.
So much uncertainty.
Absolutely.
With the ideological battle between East and West fading, did Canada shift its focus towards other areas like economic diplomacy?
Absolutely. Trade and investment became paramount tools for advancing Canada's interests in this new era. They sought to deepen economic ties with traditional partners like the U.S. and Europe, while also expanding trade relationships with emerging economies in Asia and Latin America.
Makes sense. Diversify those connections.
Mhm.
But did Canada still see a role for itself in global security matters?
Certainly. While the threat of a large-scale conflict had diminished, new security challenges emerged. Terrorism, regional conflicts, the growing urgency of climate change all demanded attention. Canada continued to participate in peacekeeping operations and contributed to NATO missions.
So those commitments continued.
They did. But the nature of these operations evolved, becoming more complex and multifaceted.
More nuanced, you might say. Could you give us an example of this shift in Canada's security engagements?
Well, in the 1990s, Canada participated in the NATO intervention in Kosovo. This was a humanitarian mission aimed at stopping ethnic cleansing and protecting civilians. It was a complex and controversial intervention, highlighting the ethical and strategic dilemmas of intervening in internal conflicts.
A tough situation, for sure. It seems like Canada was using its military power in a more targeted and nuanced way, often as part of a multilateral coalition rather than in a direct confrontation with a superpower.
Precisely. And Canada also increased its focus on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief efforts around the world, demonstrating a commitment to global citizenship and international cooperation.
Stepping up on the world stage. This shift towards a more multilateral approach to global issues seems to be a consistent theme in Canada's post-Cold War foreign policy.
Yes, Canada has consistently advocated for a rules-based international order, emphasizing diplomacy, multilateral institutions, and collective action to address global challenges.
A collaborative approach.
Exactly.
But let's shift our focus inward for a moment. How did the end of the Cold War affect Canada's domestic politics and society?
One notable development was the resurgence of Quebec separatism. With the Cold War over, some in Quebec felt that the time was ripe to revisit the question of independence. They argued that Quebec's distinct cultural identity and interests were not adequately represented within Canada.
That led to the 1995 referendum on Quebec's sovereignty right. I remember following that closely. A very tense time.
It was incredibly close. The no side, advocating for Quebec to remain within Canada, won by a razor-thin margin, just over 1%.
Wow, just barely.
It highlighted the deep divisions within Canadian society on this issue and the ongoing challenges of reconciling Quebec's aspirations with national unity.
So a close call for Canadian unity. It seems that even as the world was undergoing dramatic transformations, Canada continued to grapple with internal tensions and questions about its own identity.
Absolutely. But amidst these challenges, Canada also made significant strides in promoting multiculturalism and inclusivity. They adopted policies to recognize and celebrate the diversity of their population, acknowledging the contributions of various cultural groups to Canadian society.
Embracing diversity. And this included efforts to address past injustices against Indigenous peoples' rights.
Yes. Canada has taken steps to acknowledge the historical wrongs committed against Indigenous communities and to work towards reconciliation. This includes recognizing Indigenous land rights, promoting self-governance, and addressing systemic inequalities.
Trying to right past wrongs.
Absolutely. It's a long and complex process.
It is, but an important one. And Canada has also been a leader in environmental protection and sustainable development.
True. They have advocated for international action on climate change and have implemented policies to reduce their own environmental footprint.
So a leader on the environmental front as well.
Mm-hmm.
It seems that Canada has been striving to play a constructive role on a wide range of global issues.
Yes. They have sought to leverage their influence to promote peace diplomacy, human rights, and environmental sustainability.
But we can't ignore the elephant in the room. Canada's relationship with its powerful neighbor, the United States. How did the end of the Cold War affect that dynamic?
It's a complex relationship, marked by both deep cooperation and occasional friction. The two countries share a long border, a common language, and extensive economic ties. However, differences in economic policies, trade practices, and security priorities can sometimes lead to disagreements.
So a close but sometimes complicated relationship. Were there any specific points of contention that arose after the Cold War ended?
Trade disputes have been a recurring source of tension. For example, disagreements over softwood lumber tariffs and dairy subsidies have led to trade conflicts between the two countries.
Yes, the classic trade spats.
It seems like navigating this close but sometimes prickly relationship with the U.S. is an ongoing challenge for Canada.
Walking that tightrope. As we conclude this deep dive into Canada's journey, what are some key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, Canada's story is a testament to the idea that even countries without superpower status can exert significant influence on the world stage. Their commitment to diplomacy, multilateralism, and peacekeeping has made a tangible difference. And their ongoing efforts to promote human rights, environmental sustainability, and a more just and inclusive world serve as an inspiring example.
Really punching above their weight.
They have.
It's clear that Canada has chosen a path that prioritizes cooperation dialogue and finding common ground over military might or unilateral action.
Yes, they have consistently championed a vision of a world where diplomacy prevails, where international institutions play a vital role, and where nations work together to address shared challenges.
A powerful vision.
It's an inspiring vision and one that offers valuable lessons for all nations as we navigate an increasingly complex and interconnected world.
We've come to the end of our journey exploring Canada's remarkable rise.
From a nation on the periphery to a global player with a distinctive voice.
A voice committed to making the world a better place. It's a story filled with challenges, triumphs, and valuable insights that can inspire us all. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.